Hello and welcome to a new podcast from the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. My name is Hussein Askari. Today is Wednesday, August the 17th. Not far from the Taiwan Strait where we were last week in our podcast, we have a region formerly called the Asean, which is short for the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is the subject of our podcast this week. Now, the ASEAN consists of 10 member states. These are alphabetically Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. The ASEAN is a political and economic union which promotes intergovernmental cooperation and facilitates economic, political, security, military, educational, and sociocultural integration between its members and with countries in its vicinity in the Asia-Pacific. The ASEAN originally started in 1961 with 3 nations, which were Thailand, the Philippines, and Malaysia, but has expanded since then to 10 nations. Now, the fact that the emblem of the ASEAN features a stack of 10 rice stalks tightly tied together explains the strong economic aspect of the relationships among its members. Now, since the ASEAN and the region around it do not exist in a vacuum and are affected by all different strategic, economic, and financial crises in the world, we would like to explore how this region is interacting with the world around it. Therefore, we have invited a distinguished scholar, Dr. Swaran Singh. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Askari, for having me in your podcast series. And I look forward to this discussion with you today.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor for us to have you with us, and I appreciate that you are taking the time to speak to us. Dr. Swaran Singh is a citizen of India, but currently is a visiting professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. He is also professor and former chair at the Center of International Politics Organization and Disarmament in the School of International Studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, in India. He's also president of the Association of Asian Scholars in India. Now, we would like to start, of course, with the developments around the Taiwan Strait, which you have yourself both observed but also written about it. What do you think about this situation generally?
Thank you, Dr. Askari. I'm happy that you begin the discussion on your podcast on ASEAN, starting with what has primarily occupied international media headlines for the last 4 weeks. It is particularly related to Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taipei. And of course, as a reaction, the military exercises, in fact, the largest such military exercises that Chinese have held for about 4 days in Taiwan Straits, and how that has kind of brought global attention to tensions between Taiwan and China, but more realistically, tensions between the United States and China, and how they could really impact upon the entire region, and the axis of which is ASEAN. So ASEAN is the center point around which this larger region of Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific is knitted together. And I'm happy you raised that issue to begin with. I think it was kind of a visit which became particularly intriguing because no confirmations until the very last minute when Nancy Pelosi landed in Taipei, and world could see her on television screens being in Taipei, and of course, the next several hours in several functions, of course, she was the highlight. And that kind of secrecy and I think selective leakages about this visit underlined several things, but primarily 2 things. One, that United States was enormously concerned about how China would react to such a visit, but at the same time desirous of calling the bluff, because there were very, very strong statements coming from China, particularly from Ministry of Defense spokesperson, as to what could happen in case such a visit takes place. But at the same time, I think to a certain extent, little disjunction within United States, because you would remember that about almost 10 days before the Nancy Pelosi Asia tour was to begin, President had publicly mentioned that, he's not sure. In fact, he quoted saying that military of United States is not sure it's a good idea at this moment to undertake such a visit. So even later, they largely sort of projected this visit to be a personal decision of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. So it also reflected the kind of disjunctions and lack of unanimity when it comes to how United States wishes to engage China or engage Taiwan in its China policy. And in that sense, it fundamentally underlines the uncertainties, which I think is what makes the speculation about potential dangers particularly convincing. And it basically revealed that situation is constantly ratcheting up. The brinkmanship between China and United States is not lowering but rising incrementally, but also how United States remains completely unclear about how it wants to pursue or play its Taiwan card in its China policy. And I think this leads to insinuations of United States commitment being largely driven by domestic politics, personal sort of reasons of Nancy Pelosi, or driven by its military-industrial complex, which wants to sell weapons to Taiwan and other countries, and whether United States is really interested in helping Taiwan, because the ideal way to help Taiwan would be to ensure that more and more countries begin to recognize Taiwan, which is not happening. So, is it really a serious and sincere effort on United States' part to help Taiwan or not? And that's another serious academic question which emerges out of this recent weeks of tensions on Taiwan Straits.
Now, the ASEAN has emerged in recent years following the recovery from the 1997 Asian financial crisis as some of the fastest growing economies in Asia and in the world. The nominal GDP of the ASEAN countries is about $3.5 trillion, and per capita annual income is about $5,300 annually. But compared with the purchasing power parity, it should be at $9.7 trillion and per capita income of $14,400. Now, some of the ASEAN countries are, in this sense, in the upper ranks of the middle-income countries in the world. And the ASEAN are also have become members in very important regional economic blocs. For example, the latest one is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP, which was established in 2020 or signed in 2020. We will discuss that, of course, a point later. But how do you see the role of ASEAN in Asia and in the world?
Thank you. I think, Hussein, you asked a perfectly appropriate question at this moment, because I was mentioning how ratcheting up of tensions between the United States and China are creating uncertainties in this entire larger region of Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific. In that sense, the silver lining, therefore, remains ASEAN, which you have brought in this, your second question to me. ASEAN is really one particular forum which is acceptable to all stakeholders in this larger region, whether it is China or United States or other several European countries. The ASEAN centrality is something that every major part today spheres is kind of acceptable, and repeatedly that kind of mention is made in all the policy papers of major powers, that ASEAN centrality, ASEAN being on the driver's seat in the region, is acceptable to all. And the fundamental strength of ASEAN has been its economic rise and prosperity. And you would remember in 1970s, Japan led flying geese model of tiger economies in Southeast Asia, making it noticeable worldwide. And the United States, which used to think Pacific was an American lake, began thinking of the Pacific side of Asia, and Asia Pacific became an attractive proposition for United States. And we had the beginning of Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, where United States was engaging several of these important economies. So the point I'm making here is that economic prowess of ASEAN and political acceptability of ASEAN makes it uniquely important player, and indeed axis around which the region's development and security architecture can be knitted together and evolved. Now, what is interesting here is that, as you mentioned in the beginning, ASEAN was created in 1960s, primarily promoted, propagated, supported by United States at that time, with a simple motive of containing spread of communism at that time from China or from Soviet Union. But from 1990s, during the East Asian financial crisis, we have seen there was an incremental change, but that was an inflection point, the East Asian financial crisis, where China became a major partner of ASEAN countries. And that is also a result of the fact that China has had unprecedented economic rise since early 1990s. It is in purchasing parity terms already the largest economy on the planet, but in current dollar terms also it's the second largest economy. Estimates post-pandemic talk about 16 to 18 trillion US dollars is the size of Chinese economy, which is coming very close to American $21 trillion economy. Now, that is what makes ASEAN, face certain anxieties, because their engagement with China is not very often acceptable to United States, which is also a strong partner of ASEAN countries. And ASEAN has to do this tightrope walking between China and United States, while at the same time sustaining its own autonomy, its centrality. In fact, many of the initiatives that the United States has had lately, for example, whether it is the Five Eyes revival of intelligence agencies, or it is the quadrilateral security framework, or it is AUKUS, Australia, UK, US security mechanism, these sometimes confuse ASEAN countries whether United States is building a parallel development and security architecture. And that is where your mention of RCEP, which you mentioned we'll discuss later, becomes interesting, because economic architecture of the region seems much closely knitted to Chinese. And ASEAN was original author of the regional comprehensive economic cooperation, but China, being such a large economy in the region and center of supply and production chains, has become kind of the leading player in that RCEP in that sense, which in some sense, that's my quick last point on this question, makes this entire region look very interestingly, having a development and economic architecture where China seems to be the leader, which is the major trading partner, investor in most of these countries. But the post-World War II security architecture of the region still led by United States. So that parallel two structures are moving. Chinese are also doing defense modernization. United States is also intervening into launching economic frameworks like the recent Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Forum. But that overlap is not as visible as of now as the distinctions of US leading the security architecture, China leading the economic architecture. ASEAN has to now deal with these kind of tightrope walking, and that is, I think, is an important challenge to ASEAN. But of course, ASEAN must remain the axis and must remain on the driver's seat to ensure stability and prosperity in this region, is how most of these countries are arguing, and I think I stand with that same logic, which looks to me convincing as well.
Yeah, exactly. These nations are being pressed by these geopolitical problems. I mean, as you say, this whole thing started with the SEATO, this Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, which was like a Southeast Asian NATO organization together with the United States, the UK, and Australia, and all these other exclusive, not all-inclusive, groupings being created are for geopolitical reasons, and they exclude others. Now, as you mentioned, the relationship between the ASEAN and China, for example, is a bit different because China is very close to these nations geographically. There are three nations who have direct borders with China, and others share sea, the South China Sea with China, and so on and so forth. So it's to ask those nations to be part of something different than their neighborhood, it makes it a bit a strange proposal. But also, I mean, as you say, these nations have to be in the driver's seat in a way. When Nancy Pelosi was in Taiwan, the foreign ministers of ASEAN were meeting in Cambodia, I think, and they issued a very balanced statement, but they also emphasized the fact that They are committed to the One China policy as an important aspect of their relationship to China and this whole question. Now, these nations are also, if we come to the question of the Belt and Road Initiative, the ASEAN nations are all members of the Belt and Road Initiative. They are also members of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. One of the main 6 Belt and Road corridors, which is the Indo-China corridor connecting by land from southern China to Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, and further south to Malaysia and potentially to Indonesia. And in 2020, the Hong Kong Institute for Emerging Market Studies counted almost 52 large-scale infrastructure projects being built jointly by China and the ASEAN countries. These range from railway projects like the China-Laos Railway, which was inaugurated last year. We have the Malaysia East Coast Rail project, which is under construction, and a number of large dams, hydropower plants, coal power plants, renewable power, highways, roads, and industrial zones. There are also a number of free trade zones built between the different countries on the border between China and the different countries of ASEAN. But how would the Belt and Road Initiative contribute to expanding the relationship and role of ASEAN within the Belt and Road, but also connecting to China itself?
Thank you. I think the Belt and Road Initiative is an interesting formulation, partly because the world in about last 40 to 50 years has moved from focusing on military security to focusing on economic security, or as we say, shift from geostrategy to geoeconomics. And that makes China's unusual economic rise significant in making it a global or regional player, or even sometimes a superpower in the region in that sense. I often say that countries like Japan and Germany also became economic powerhouses in 1970s and later, but that was a very different period, in which case the economic power was not seen as such a central component of national comprehensive strength. And therefore, they never became, of course, such influential players like China has become. That was also partly because both Germany and Japan were seen as junior partners of United States, whereas China is seen as a challenge and a rival of United States. So that's where China is located, in that entire drift from geostrategy to geoeconomics. Now, even if several of the partner nations in Belt and Road Initiative have often had enormous difficulties, very close friends like Pakistan has seen Imran Khan threatening to walk out of CPEC at some stage, Mahathir Mohamad threatening a similar thing at some stage. That's usual. In any economic relationship, there are complications, there is no doubt. But what is important here is very large number of countries which are largely infrastructure deficit countries have become partners of China's Belt and Road Initiative. China claims as many as 150 countries perhaps are directly, indirectly engaged in various projects of Belt and Road Initiative, which is enormous. Now, difference is that United States engagement is still seen in the older paradigm of post World War II arrangements. And you made mention briefly of Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, Central Treaty Organization in the same region where we are talking ASEAN is located. And that was an experiment post World War II, where United States was trying to replicate NATO kind of security architecture in Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific region. And therefore you had these alliances of this nature, of ANZUS, also Australia, New Zealand, and United States, another military alliance, which of course survived. Now, CETO and CENTO did not survive because this was a region with enormous diversity, both in the size of the countries, religion of the countries, culture, ethnicity, whatever, on several parameters. And that kind of military alliance did not work here. And that is how United States shifted to something called hub and spokes strategy, having bilateral alliances with Japan, with South Korea, with Philippines, with Singapore, and creating security arrangements around those, and of course, parallel supporting ASEAN, which we already discussed. Now, that apparently, despite enormous engagement that United States has in terms of economic partnerships in the region, still it appears overbearing. So most people do not realize that United States economic engagement in this region is equally enormous, except that the popular image of United States engagement of Asia Pacific remains one of security architecture. Second, China is the new player in the field now. And therefore, China's engagement looks like primarily driven by economic partnerships of trade and investments. China has had several advantages. I just mentioned unprecedented economic rise of China, which suddenly gives Chinese enormous economic leverages to continue with mostly one-sided trade and one-sided investments, because unlike most other countries which have democracies and multi-party system and a very popular independent media, Chinese have advantage of one-party rule and no questions asked. If the leadership decides to go and invest enormous money in a particular country, even if there are absolutely zero sort of commercial and viability of that project, there are no questions asked. So that enormous capability that China has in one-sided trade and investment in this region makes it very attractive to many of these regimes, particularly. So China never asks questions of whether they follow any international law, whether they have a democracy, they follow human rights. They simply engage with the local regimes, and that makes it very efficient way of investing in many of these countries across Asia Pacific. So China does stand that advantage in that sense, and ASEAN can't be really staying away from it. ASEAN really wishes to take advantage of this opportunity of China willing to invest in infrastructure in these countries, and therefore they have no problem, except, as you mentioned, that there are now 3 countries which are members of ASEAN. They have land borders with China, plus there are other 4, and if you include Taiwan, 5, which also have difficulties when it comes to South China Sea claims. But nevertheless, we have noticed that even inside some of these nations, which apparently have issues with China, leaders have often been lured or attracted by China's enormous potential to invest and then do enormous amount of trade with these countries, and that attraction of China cannot be ignored at all. So ASEAN definitely, in that sense, despite all its limitations in terms of being very close partner of United States or other sort of reservations in terms of how it should be engaging China, would still continue to engage with China with economic terms. And I think very briefly in 10 seconds, India would be a great example where India has enormous issue with Chinese, but the trade is still going showing enormous growth between these 2 nations. So nations are beginning to separate now. They want to deal with economic partnerships separately than how they look at their security relationships.
Yeah, I think we will discuss also the question of India-China relationship and what is more common and what is dividing those countries. But also, I mean, the fact that China is attractive, as you mentioned, is both it puts its financial and economic and engineering capability behind the Belt and Road. But I mean, I looked at the numbers of the ASEAN foreign direct investment. China is not the largest foreign direct investor in the ASEAN. It's the European Union, it's the United States, it's Japan and Korea. China is increasing, but these countries are still attracting massive investments from the West. So there's no conflict there. The difference is that the investments, Western investments, they are looking for profit, like utilizing the comparative advantages, the cheap labor, and so on. But what is special about the Belt and Road initiatives that because these nations, for them to continue to develop, and from being like China was, from a quantity, cheap labor-based production to high-quality industrial, technological production, you need a modern infrastructure, which is that's what is lacking in the Western dealing with, whether with Asia, but with Africa. There is no investment in the basic infrastructure like transport, power, water, and so on, which keeps those nations hostage to only their cheap labor is making profit, but the economy in general is not growing. And I think this is what even is as you mentioned, China is attractive for those nations. Now, the fact that those nations are also keeping a equal distance to many powers is interesting, because as we mentioned, the fact that we had in 2020 the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership was established. All the ASEAN nations are there, and the RCEP is a free trade agreement among the Asia Pacific nations. Plus, we had the ASEAN and Australia, Japan, South Korea, and China. New Zealand is also included there. So this way, you have these 15 member countries account for about 30% of the world's population, around 2.2 billion people, 30% of the global GDP, that is $29.7 trillion. And this makes it, the RCEP, the largest trade bloc in history. The signing took place in November 2020, it's also the first major trade agreement among the largest economies in Asia, which include China, Indonesia, Japan, and South Korea. So this is a very interesting major development, where you have these countries that being pulled into these geopolitical constellations like the AUKUS, the Quad, and other, but now they are all working together with ASEAN, with China, on economic cooperation and trade. So how is the RCEP shaping economic relations in this part of the world? And will this help China, for example, to reduce its dependence on the US market, given the fact that we have had these trade wars, tariff wars between China and the United States, but it was triggered by the United States first?
I think that's the interesting point I was making at end of my last response to your question. How nations have decided that they need to separate their economic engagements from their security engagements and engage both China and United States. In fact, there's a whole new debate now about more and more countries opting for non-alignment, which is originally an idea that several countries, including India, had propagated after Second World War, because they are trying to now align with both sides and therefore not align with only one side in that sense. And this debate has become particularly interesting in the context of recent Ukraine crisis, which we have noticed. But let me come back to the ASEAN and Asia Pacific that we are discussing today. Very clearly, RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, was an ASEAN initiative. But once you bring in China into it, that mention of nearly $29 trillion has to be understood in terms of $16 to $18 trillion being only China, and rest of the 15 countries together forming that kind of grouping. And that brings enormous advantage to China because of the size of economy. We all understand China manufactures about 30% of global products, which is again enormous. The next largest country, which is measured in terms of manufacturing, is United States, which manufactures about half of what China manufactures. Next to that is Japan, which manufactures 1/4 of what China manufactures. So in that sense, one has to realize the size of economy and production of China is what makes it inordinately powerful even within the RCEP arrangement. And that is how India felt. India was part of negotiations throughout, until in the end, in the final draft of the treaty, India realized that its concerns were not being met. India felt it would be really at enormous disadvantage because already for several years, India has had trade deficit against India in favor of 11 of these other 15 countries that today form RCEP. Interesting it is that the trade deficit with China, which has persisted over a decade now or more, is enormous. It's like out of $125 billion of trade last year, India was exporting roughly about $25 billion and importing about $100 billion. And that kind of one-sided trade with most of these countries would have been rectified if they had agreed to listen to certain concerns that India has had. For example, how to open its market to Indian small industries, medium and small industries, how to open these countries for India's skilled manpower. And those concerns obviously were not met, and India felt that those floodgates will open up and Indian small and medium industries will be suffering. Indian skilled manpower would be also in greater competition because cheap imported products would walk into India and therefore create a certain danger for Indian manufacturing. So India has serious concerns and decided to finally stay away from. So it's not complete no. It could be potentially possible India will join, but so far India is not part of RCEP. Now look at the other side of emboldened China. Since China was able to, sort of ensure that its vision is what really is sort of writ large on RCEP, it has now placed its application to what used to be Trans-Pacific Partnership, but after President Trump walked out of it, it is being revived, led by Japan, as comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. China wants to also get into it and maybe take over that entire exercise. Yes, to some extent, it is definitely compelled by China ensuring a more balanced opportunities for its foreign trade. China is the largest foreign trading country for almost, I think, since a decade or so. And therefore, it has to keep constantly looking for more and more opportunities. Even smaller countries in South Pacific, for example, are now the countries where China is engaging enormously. But nevertheless, I think that kind of engagement does have a strategic sort of vision behind it. Often economic leverages are used to wield political influence. That is not something which can be completely ignored. And China's political influence has also risen over a period of time. And that is what also makes some of the countries, particularly United States and its friends and allies, far more cautious of how to deal with China, because it's not an innocent commercial relationship that China is expanding enormously. And therefore, repeated concerns of how China should really be accepting more and more the existing international laws, norms, and institutions. And many of these Western countries feel in their own judgment that China perhaps is often not really complying with some of these. In case of South China Sea is significant in the region that we are discussing, because the Hague-based Permanent Court of Arbitration in 2016 June had given an arbitration which was not accepted by the Chinese. Interesting it is that by that time, the leader in Philippines, the country that had taken the suit to the Permanent Court of Arbitration, leader had changed, and the new leader said, I don't care about Permanent Court of Arbitration revoking China's claim on South China Sea. And Rodrigo Duterte, the new leader, was more interested in Chinese investments. And in that sense, that kind of, I think, uncertainties which China's rise has created in the region are constantly a matter of concern. But it is not to be belied also. It cannot be ignored at all that China is an enormous juggernaut on the move now. And one has to be very careful because completely ignoring China's rise and desire to engage neighboring countries would also be counterproductive. All neighbors have to just make sure that they are able to engage China as much on their own terms and not really pushed around and sort of told to sign on the dotted line kind of a situation, which sometimes happens. And so that's a constant challenge of uncertainties as China expands its influence, which is inevitable. I understand that is a irreversible transformation that China is rising.
Yeah, the backside of free trade, of course, going back to the British Empire, is that the powerful economies always dominate. And therefore nations have the right to protect their interests, economic interests, and therefore these treaties, these agreements have to be balanced in a way to protect the rights of the smaller nations against the bigger economies, because there's no real balance between. I don't know much about the Southeast Asian situation, but I was looking at in a sense, we lost a lot also in Europe, industries fleeing to the East and created a big problems. But then European economies had to adjust to this new reality and focus on special industries and create a certain division of labor among nations. But like, for example, the relationship of the EU to North African countries. When it comes to agriculture, we have a free agricultural trade agreement, but the North African farmers can never, under the current conditions, compete with European farmers who are subsidized, who are backed by big corporations, who have the most advanced technologies and machinery and everything. So it's very difficult for North African farmers to compete with European farmers. Therefore, many nations abandoned grain production in favor of fruits and vegetables so they can compete with the Europeans. But now, under the current food crisis, all the North African countries have a crisis because they import almost all the grain they need. So therefore, this, as you are right, I mean, India had the right to argue that, because of the major deficit with China, India had to protect its own industries, medium and small size industries, which is the right of every nation, of course. But this does not mean that the road is blocked. And this brings us to the question of the China-India relations. How can we, now there's an enormous tension. There are nationalistic, emotions on both sides, and there was skirmishes on the border and all that stuff. But how do you see moving from here to a more normal relationship? How does it go this way?
I think that one has to be careful as to what do we call normal relationship. Among large-sized countries, you understand, China and India, first of all, in population terms, are almost 1.4 billion people on both sides. And the largest next country, United States, is just 1/4 of the size. Indeed, the United Nations Department of Population report now says India in November would cross China and become the largest population country on the planet. And so the size of countries is significant, but also the history. These are the two continuing civilizations for at least 5,000 years, if not more. And in that sense, civilizational state means that their symbolisms and semantics are very significant to understand how they deal with each other, how their vision has to be understood and interpreted. And that, I think, is important to keep in mind when we say, what is the kind of normal relationship between China and India going to be, and when it is going to be normal. I think India and China are already in a normal relationship. There is no boycotting of each other on any of the terms. You would have seen their foreign ministers meeting repeatedly, in fact, more often than they have done before. A whole range of dozens of dialogues between two countries are continuing. We recently had the 16th round of Corps Commanders negotiations on the line of actual control. So talks are continuing at all various levels. So also interactions. I just mentioned the trade rising to $125 billion last year. And exchange of people is also continuing, despite the fact that pandemic meant that most people were not traveling around the world. But as we begin to deal with the pandemic, or pandemic begins to wane away, there is conversation already that how Indian students, there are about 23 to 24,000 Indian students who were studying in China. Most of them had come back to India, and they have to now start going back to China. And therefore, the relationship is, I would say, multifaceted. And there are areas where both countries are constantly cooperating. If you look at them working on issues of climate change, for example, energy security, terrorism, several other global and regional issues, you will see that they are often seen as cooperating. Some other areas, they are coordinating their activities. Then there are areas where they're contesting each other and borders for confrontation with each other. So there's a whole range of different spectrum of colors that define, I think, this complex relationship. To me, that's a normal relationship, because as long as they're able to manage, both sides, you have countries equipped with nuclear weapons, countries having enormously potent, powerful, and large armed forces. And if they are only managing their relationship into occasional pushing and shoving on a line of control, to me, that's an enormous restraint on both sides. And that to me looks normal. Now, am I ambitious or optimist to say that everything will be hunky-dory and they will become friends tomorrow? I don't think so. Because even if they are able to resolve their border, the historical issue which they've had for 70 years, they would have new issues. For example, any two large countries next to each other, both ambitious of emerging as great powers, emerging as large economies. India is now recognized by World Bank as the fastest growing large economy. 7 to 8% growth rate is predicted for this year. Now, these are going to be definitely creating new complications. For example, India's enormous footprint in terms of pandemic time, India is being recognized as pharmacy of the world, supplying first medicines like hydroxychloroquine or paracetamol, and then, of course, largest producer and exporter of vaccines. China is also likewise going around the world and helping several countries, and that will create new, issues and concerns as to, are they undercutting each other? How are they seeking and building those partnerships? So, between these rising two powers in Asia, which by 25 are supposed to be the largest and the third largest economies on the planet, there will be constantly other issues emerging. What is important is to recognize that so far they are able to manage their irritations relatively, with the very rare incidents like what happened in June of 2020, which is unfortunate, but they have largely managed their bilateral relationship. You have noticed India repeatedly answering, whether it is United States or European nations who are proposing that they could mediate in India-China relations. India's standard answer has been India can manage its relationship with China on its own, and there is no need for any other country to mediate in it. That confidence, I think, reflects that they're able to manage their bilateral relationships despite new challenges emerging all the time. Yeah. To me, that is already the normal relationship.
Yeah. Now that's very, very important thing to mention, because these facts you mentioned about that there's continuous economic cooperation, education cooperation, dialogue among the military, because the only thing you hear about China, India, and the Western media is that they are fighting each other the whole time. There's no contact. They are, almost at war the whole time. And it's very important that you are mentioning these important facts. Probably it's not simply a bilateral issue. If we take India and China into a larger context, where they, for example, we had India, China, but also Russia. These are all members in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is expanding. Iran was a member. By the way, Pakistan is also there, an important neighbor of India and China, but also an important player in the Belt and Road Initiative, and also a region in the region after the US and NATO withdrawal from Afghanistan. Now, how do you see all these changes in a certain way, positive or negative? That you have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization coming into a synergy with the Belt and Road Initiative, the Eurasian Economic Union. So you have a Eurasian bloc, so to speak, where India and China are equal members in that, although they are large members in that, but they are equal members of a bigger family, so to speak. That helps indirectly to change the relationship.
I think, just like we mentioned in the beginning of today's podcast, that in the Southeast Asian region, Taiwan Straits is an important issue, and we started the discussion with that. In South Asia or Southwest Asia, if you want to call it, or even Central Asia, issue of Afghanistan remains very significant. And this sudden, very unusual exit of NATO forces and United States from Afghanistan has created enormous challenges. I have sometimes called it regime change in reverse. United States from early 1990s, you would remember George Bush Jr. had talked about preemptive strikes, global war on terrorism, and of course regime change, the new doctrine, where they were going out in countries that they thought were not able to really provide sort of welfare and justice to their own citizens. And there was an ethnic cleansing or any other reason they would go and change the regime in those from outside. Now, here is a regime change from inside. Taliban has changed the regime supported by United States. Now, that is an unusual challenge with Taliban being in command, not recognized by a single nation so far, even Pakistan, which is closest country to Taliban. No recognition as yet, but reality is Taiwan is ruling Afghanistan. And that throws up enormous challenge to the very stability of the region, to the peace and prosperity of the region. And in that context, after exit of NATO and United States, the neighboring countries become much more important because they are the immediate recipients of that negative impact of instability. So whether it is Iran or it is China or it is Pakistan or Russia or Central Asian republics or India, there is an enormous responsibility on these countries. And as you mentioned, there is a forum, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where all of them sit together. And it's not now. For several years, Shanghai Cooperation Organization has been inviting Afghanistan as a special invitee, has held conferences on Afghanistan. Even the recent meeting in Uzbekistan had preceded with a conference on Afghanistan. And just because they have major stakes being neighbors of Afghanistan, of instability or stability in Afghanistan, Shanghai Cooperation Organization to me is an ideal forum where issues of instability in Afghanistan must be dealt with. Several countries have adopted very, very innovative approaches. And since you mentioned Pakistan, I agree. And there can be no solutions in Afghanistan without Pakistan being an active player in those solutions. In fact, Taliban is appearing to be disappointed with Pakistan not being able to obtain Taliban recognition so far. And they have lately shown certain irritations and tensions on the border, on the Durand line between Pakistan and Afghanistan. But what I want to highlight is innovative approaches within these neighboring countries. For example, India and Pakistan has not been talking, mostly not talking to each other unless there are back channel discussions, which may be known much later, because of their mutual views on terrorism. But on this issue of Taliban, India and Pakistan were able to talk to each other. India was able to convince Pakistan to allow land corridors through Pakistan to provide India's humanitarian assistance to people in Afghanistan. And that kind of innovative approach, I think, is an example where neighbors, because they are immediate recipients of instability and the negative impact of that instability, they can really work together in Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And the coming summit meeting, I suppose, should really focus on some of these areas as important and how they can think out of box to make sure that Shanghai Cooperation Organization can bring peace, stability, and at least basic amenities to people who are suffering in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I think the interesting what you mentioned here, that there should be a new paradigm, because we wrote last year, and also we presented some proposals on the integration of Afghanistan into the Belt and Road, but also into its neighborhood economically, and to build the transport corridors, the pipelines, the decades-long discussions about the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline, and so on and so forth. That the 200 years of the great game British geopolitics was ending, and now is probably the era of geoeconomics is coming into play, and that this should be the norm now, that nations can normalize relations, you can establish peace and security, not by security means or military means, but by economic means, but by putting the horse in front of the cart rather than the opposite. Of course, there are security issues among nations, but without resolving all these economic matters and raising the living standard of people in Afghanistan, it would be very difficult to cope with these things. And I think this brings us to the final question. I mean, you mentioned the fact that India and China, it's not a question of normal relations. These are, thousands of years civilizations. I remember when I was writing my review of a book, it's called Paper Before Print, The History and Impact of Paper in the Islamic World. And it's by Jonathan Bloom. It's a fascinating story about how the production of paper in industrial scale moved from China to the Islamic world in the 8th century, and then expanded all the way to Europe, that this was a major revolution actually in dissemination of scientific, technological, and cultural and philosophical knowledge from China, from India, from Greece, So you had this like internet today. Paper became such an important vehicle. But in the beginning of the book, it discusses the fact that the interaction between India and China was so important, not only because all the monks, the Buddhist monks who would, moving from India into China, they were required to learn how to make pens and produce ink and produce papers for their teachings. And that this was some sort of the interaction between these civilizations. So what I argued in that book review is that the Silk Road, whether the new Silk Road or the old Silk Road, are not simply about trade. It's not about silk. It's not about spices, although these existed. But what is the most important things that moved along the Silk Road and today, then and today, is scientific, technological, cultural products that nations can learn from each other, nations can contribute to each other in that sense. And I think India and China have a very, very special relationship in that sense. I mean, in China, you have the Journey to the West, one of the most popular legends, and so I would like to hear what you think about that.
I'm happy, Dr. Hussain Askari, you are closing the program with this broad brush mention of the book, underlining the length of the relationship between China and India. Indeed, to put it in a very, very quick fashion, until industrial revolution of 19th century or middle of 19th century, actually, China and India were the largest producers of the world and were known globally for very, very special products, silk or several other artifacts or cotton. And these artisans were world famous. In fact, that is what, when knowledge about India and China started spreading around the world because of trading communities, that it brought in several outsiders into both China and India who were attracted to come and see these economically prosperous, socially developed civilizations of that time. And of course, Industrial Revolution, where both China and India missed the bus as if. I'm not sure if we should be regretting that, because all your problems of climate change today, which are existential problems, started with Industrial Revolution. And imagine if there was no Industrial Revolution, there will be no climate change crisis today. But anyway, that's a separate point. Indeed, that is how world today is looking at how China and India would again, by middle of 21st century, this century, would go back and become one of the largest and third largest producers and economies on this planet. And that is ordained simply by the fact because of their populations, because of their large land size, the fertility and the diversity of the resources that their land has, and of course their access to technology now. So in that sense, if you look at leaders of China and India increasingly becoming aware of their inordinate opportunity in coming times to not just provide welfare, peace, and prosperity to their own populations, which itself means bulk of the world population, but also go out and contribute to other societies and other nations, and then their bilateral irritants become really much smaller, because they have now this unusual opportunities in coming decades to change the face of the planet, and to change the way we look at life and how we live life. And in that sense, once Indian and Chinese leaders begin to focus on this inordinate opportunity, they will look at their responsibilities very differently. They will measure their challenges very differently. And that is how increasingly we notice that both China and India are beginning to work together in larger regional and global issues, where we notice much more synergy than anxieties, anger, and confrontation. And that, in fact, has a positive spin on how they are able to better manage what was their bilateral or historical irritations between them. And I think that is the new normal, where you have this larger footprint of Belt and Road Initiative, larger footprint of Indian initiatives like International Solar Alliance, which is where I think their interactions are going to be at a very different level at regional and global sort of forums where they're addressing those challenges. And I think that would help us understand that we are deeply rooted in our civilization and culture. And once that connection is made and is being made in both China and India, we possibly will see greater stability in their bilateral relations, which you rightly mentioned, and doesn't only impact their bilateral relations, but has impact at much larger level as well. Thank you, Dr. Hussain Askari, for making me part of your podcast series, and I hope our listeners would have some takeaway from discussion today.
I thank you very much for taking the time for being with us. I mean, our discussion has taken much longer time than we anticipated. I mean, we can go on for hours, but we have a limitation. I mean, one thing to mention is that China and India are already changing the face of Earth. There was a study by NASA released 2 years ago. I wrote an article about it, that China and India together, they increased the green cover on the whole planet by 20%. Due to their agriculture activity and also afforestation projects, fighting deserts and planting forests and so on. So these two countries are changing the face of Earth already, and we hope that they will contribute together even more. I thank you very much for taking the time for being with us. It's a great pleasure for us. Hopefully we'll see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.